Hey, how's it going? It's Lee Halliday, and today we are going to talk about testing code that makes HTTP requests. For starters, you want to try to avoid making HTTP requests in your tests because A, it's slow, B, it's unpredictable. What if that server's down? Do you want your test to fail? And what if the values change? For example, the weather, it's 20 degrees today, 15 tomorrow. Your code can't really predict how many degrees it's going to be outside. But lastly, you may not want to actually call that server every time you run your test. For example, what if you're testing sending money between bank accounts or charging a credit card, etc. So typically what I've done in the past is I've mocked out the underlying package that makes that HTTP request, like Fetch or Axios, sort of swap that out, replace it with a fake version that just responds with a canned sort of prepared for response. Kent C. Dodds, the maker of testing library and a ton of other packages in JavaScript and React, he mentions that he no longer recommends mocking Fetch and Axios, and instead he recommends using MSW, which stands for mock service worker. So that's what we're covering today, how to write tests using mock service worker to avoid making actual HTTP requests. Let's start by talking about what is a service worker. So this handy diagram I found here, when you think about your code making an HTTP request, you're sort of starting in your application over here on the left, and you call fetch sort of in the browser or in Node. It goes across the internet, this represented by this network here, and it talks to that external server, which receives the request and responds back to your app with whatever data. Now, what a server worker does is sort of plops itself in the middle, sort of like a man-in-the-middle attack, you could say. And what it does is it intercepts that request before it goes out to the internet, and then it can decide what to do. Do I want to check if I have a pre-cached value so that we don't have to waste time going over the network? But in our case, what we're going to do is basically intercept the request and then just respond with whatever value we want so that we can avoid making that external HTTP request. What this allows us to do is sort of set ourselves up a step higher from, instead of mocking out sort of low-level packages and whatnot, we're treating our tests more like how a user would use our code, which is always a good thing. So keep this in mind, we're plopping ourselves in the middle between our app code making the request, and we're intercepting it before it goes out to the network over here. So what code are we testing? This is sort of a setup of the test we're going to be writing. So we're importing a function called convert from this file currency, and we're testing to make sure that it converts correctly. So when you pass in sort of give me the USD to CAD conversion rate, we expect that it equals 1.42. So I haven't set anything up yet, so if I were to run this test, it's actually going to make the real HTTP request, and I'll show you the unpredictability nature of it. So we come back here and we expected 1.42, but we actually received 1.34036, etc. So we can't really prepare for that, right? And this is where we are going to put that service worker in there to intercept the request and respond with sort of our own server response of 1.42. So the first thing I need to do is import the packages that we are going to be using. So I've already added them to the package.json. Just go down and find them. So the first one is this whatwg fetch. So we don't actually need this in our specific use case, but what it does is it polyfills fetch. Let me just stop these tests. It polyfills fetch because Node doesn't come with fetch out of the box. So what this will do is ensure that your environment has fetch installed. In Create React App, that's not necessary because I think they polyfilled themselves, but it doesn't cause any harm. Next thing we're going to be doing is using the MSW package, mock service worker. So we're going to be importing two things from it. The first is something called REST, which will help us mock out RESTful requests, which is what we're doing. But they also have one for GraphQL that you could use if that's what you're doing. And we're also going to import a function from MSW node. And what's it called? Setup server. That's it. Cool. So we'll use that setup server to create ourselves a server. And this will be server equals setup server. And what you pass to the server are a number of request handlers. Each of these request handlers basically looks for one URL or one pattern, and it intercepts that request, and then it can handle how it should respond rather than going out on the internet and actually making that request. So let's set up our first one now. We use REST, and we're going to intercept a GET request. And the first thing you put in here is the parameter, is the URL you want it to look for to intercept. So if we go over to the actual code, I've actually got sort of two twin functions that do the same thing. One uses fetch, one uses Axios, and this is just to show that it doesn't really matter which one you're using. Mock Service Worker works for both of them. So I'm exporting the fetch version as this convert. And what fetch does right here is it makes a GET request to this URL. If the result is not okay, it throws an exception. Request failed with status code of 404 or whatever. If it is okay, it comes down here and we parse out the JSON and we access the rates and we get the conversion rate for the destination currency. Axios is the same. GET request to this URL. We await for it since it's promises, and then we return the data we want. Axios raises an exception if the request has a 404 or a 500 or whatever. So that's why I added it to the fetch version to sort of make them act the same. But yeah, we're going to be starting with the fetch version. So that's what it does. Let's copy the URL. You don't need the whole thing. It sort of pattern matches. So as long as you have sort of the part of the request that you need to make it unique from the other ones. Oh, grab the whole thing, one sec. Paste that in there. Okay, so the second thing you pass to this function is a callback. And this is where you handle how the server should respond. So you're given three things: the actual request, this response function you calls to trigger the response back, and context to help you build up those responses. So we will return the response, and to it we use this context to set the status of the response. So let's say it was a success, and the second one will be the JSON, the body of the response. So we wanted it to look like rates, and then the destination, and then let's set it to 1.43 so we can check to see if it's actually working. And if we run the tests again, we'll see that it's still not using it. So it's still going to be the 1.34 or whatever. And that's because we need to tell the server to start listening. So we can do that using some jest callbacks. So the before all runs once before, and we'll tell the server to listen. We can do the after all to tell the server to stop listening, to close itself, server.close. And then we can do the after each. And what we'll do here is when we set up our server, we give it a bunch of request handlers, but you can override them and prepend them in each of your individual tests. What we're doing here is we're basically resetting it back to the original state, whatever was passed to this function here. So this is reset handlers, like that. Oop, there we go. Cool. So with these in place, the server should be running, and we should see that it will fail, but it will fail with 1.43, which is what we've got. So now we can just update this to 1.42, and we are good to go. Just wait for that to finish. Great. So let's work on a test that handles failure. So our test will be it handles failure. And this is async because we've got promises going on. And what we are going to do is override our normal request handler. So why don't we just copy this for now. So the way you sort of prepend additional ones is you access the server and you tell it to use one or more additional request handlers. And it adds those to the beginning of sort of the list it steps through. And what we want to do is switch this from a 200, let's say, to a 404. And we won't even send a JSON response, we'll just do the 404, like that. So in this case, what does our code do when it actually fails? It throws this exception. So how do you sort of test for whether an exception was thrown inside of jest. One way you can do it is you can say expect, and then you call the code that should raise an exception. So convert, let's convert from like fail to CAD. And promises, you always have sort of two flows, positive and negative, success or failure. So the positive is when you resolve the promise, the failure is when you reject it. So what you can do here is you can access sort of the rejects, and then you expect them to throw, and then you can sort of put in text here that you expect to be in the exception message. So let's put gobbledygook just to test that things are working right. And we have to await this because it's asynchronous. So if we run this again, we'll just wait for this to finish up. Our test should fail, and we were expecting FDFDSS, and we actually got request failed with a status of 404. So that's what we actually wanted. So let's just replace this with 404, and this test should be passing now. Cool. So one thing I thought would be a good idea is you never really want to, what if you forget to add the proper request handler? You don't want the actual request going out onto the internet. So what you could do is add like a fallback request handler. We can just say get request anything star. Call this request handler. So we've got the request, the response, and the context like we saw above. What we can do is we can say console.error. Please add request handler for, and then we can access the request's URL, convert it to a string, and that will be printed out to the console. We can also return a response that just is a 500 error, so like a server failure. And we could even add JSON as well that says error, please add request handler, like that. So let's say, let's come back here and let's, sorry about that. Let's change this so that it wouldn't match. And then we should see that new error because it will hit the fallback request handler. Perfect. Please add request handler for, and then the URL that was being called. And it raises an exception and all that stuff. So it blocks us from making an actual HTTP request. So we're going to do a bit of refactoring now because we want to start testing a component we have, this app that ends up calling our convert function. But we don't want to have to repeat all of this stuff, the before handlers and whatnot, every time you want to write a test that calls an HTTP. So what we'll do is we'll create a file called setup server or test server, let's say, like that. And we'll copy over most of the things. So we'll cut out sort of actually, let's just grab all of this and then remove what we don't need. So we don't need the convert function here. And what do we want to export to make available? Let's export the server, and let's export REST so that you can say server.use and you can add in additional request handlers like that. So coming back to our test here, we can now clean out all of this code. We can clean out our imports because they're being done already in this file. And then we can just import what we need. So server and REST from test server. So while these tests are running, have a sip of the coffee. And it all still works. So to avoid sort of the scenario where you forget to add this import to your file, or where you don't want to override any of the defaults, what we could actually do is import this same test server file inside of the setup tests file that comes with Create React App. This is a file that's run once prior to sort of executing all of the jest tests. So we'll just import from local test server here. And now, no matter what test you're in, it's always going to have a sort of a test server set up and listening for requests to intercept them. So with that in place, just for fun, we could pop this fetch version over to Axios, and fingers crossed it all still passes. And okay, I think it's good. Yeah. Cool. So we'll just keep it on Axios for now. Going over to writing some tests for our app component. First of all, let's take a look at what the app component does. So what it does, it's pretty simple, but it sort of sets up two hard-coded currencies from USD to CAD, puts them in variables like that. And it uses use SWR, which is a hook from the folks at Vercel, the makers of Zeit, that helps you sort of write code that makes HTTP or asynchronous requests of any kind, anything that returns a promise. And it does all sorts of things like caching on window. If you like switch tabs in your browser, when you focus the window again, it will remake that request. And it uses sort of stale data until it can go to the server and revalidate that request. That's where it gets its name from, stale while revalidate. So what this does is it receives base and destination, these two guys here, and it ends up calling this convert function that we've already looked at a couple times. So if there's an error, we return a span that says error. If there's no rate yet, so no data, we'll assume that we're still loading. And if we get past that, we have our data, so we just display that here. So the test for this component, I've already got one set up, and I've just X'd it out, so let me actually run this code. So it renders our app component. It gives us a function called findByText that we can look for the amount. That gives us back an element, and we can expect that element to be in the document. So if I just tell it to run all tests below, so that one's passing. Why is it passing? Because inside of the setup tests, I'd imported our test server. Our test server intercepted that request and it responded with 1.42. So that's sort of what I'm talking about. You get out of the box. Maybe you add sort of all of your common requests that your app makes into the standard file, and then you override it as necessary. But let's tackle testing failure again. So it handles errors. So this is async. There's a couple gotchas, not so much with the mock state worker, but with the SWR that I've run into. So what we're going to do is copy this down here, except we expect to see error, not the typical code. And we need to override our mock service worker. So let's import server and rest from test server. Move that up there. So it's the same code I had before in the other file. So I'm actually just going to copy this over for the sake of time. So we've told it to prepend this request handler to respond with a 404. That should trigger an exception, which our component will render out in this span tab here. So if this were to work, we'd all be really happy. We'd end the video now, but at least I've been running into problems, and it's part of the goodness that use SWR gives you, but it caches results. So what happened here was it ran the test once and then again, and SWR sort of cached the one from here, and then when it made the same request here, it never even sort of got to our service worker, it just used the cache response. So we need to basically add a way to tell SWR, like, don't look at your cache, just fresh cache every time. So let's import a couple things from SWR to do that. The first thing is SWR config. We'll config it. There's this thing called a deduping interval to basically say, if you see multiple requests that look the same, normally it dedupes them, but just ignore that. And we're also going to access the cache to clear it out after each test. So we'll say after each, access the SWR cache and clear it. is the function to call. And we will wrap the SWR config around our component that we're rendering. Oh boy, what did I do? Cool. And here we can pass in sort of config values, and we'll use the deduping interval and set that to 0. So I'm just going to copy this down to here, like that, so that neither of them now are dealing with deduping, and the cache is being cleared every time. And it looks like it's passing, so let's make it fail just to double check. Come on, you can do it. Don't give up. Okay, so it actually did render out an error, which is what we wanted. So let's just make this test pass again. And then I think that is it. We've covered a number of topics in this video. Basically how to avoid low-level sort of mocking Fetch or Axios, and instead insert a service worker that can intercept the request. So what we did is we set up that service worker, and then we gave it a couple sort of default request handlers that when they see this request going out, it won't go out to the internet. It will sort of capture it and then respond with sort of whatever you want. You're basically writing a backend server here if you've ever worked with Express, where you sort of, when this route matches, respond with this information sort of thing. So we set up some jest hooks, the before all to start the server, the after all to stop it, to close it, and then after each to reset the handlers back to the original ones. And then we basically just went about implementing that. So this one was standard. We didn't override it at all. This one, we prepended an additional request handler so that we could basically get our server to respond with a 404. And we tested that it correctly throws that 404. And then we went over to the React side of things, and we tested our component sort of standard, everything's passing. And then we did the same sort of failure. But the only thing we added was clearing out the SWR cache and also adding in the avoid deduping as much as possible so that one test isn't affecting another test. One cool thing that is not going to be covered in this video is that MSW can be used not only in testing, but when you're writing and developing an app, you can sort of insert that service worker to have a server respond with fake responses, so that even if sort of whoever's doing the backend, even if it's you, if you haven't done it yet, you can insert a fake backend using the mock service worker. For those that speak Spanish, I am going to re-record this video later today in Spanish. It's probably going to be a disaster, but I will link to it in the description below. So if it's not there yet, just come back the next day and it should be there. And I'd love to have you on board if you want to subscribe. I'm doing JavaScript and React videos, trying for every week. Hope you're doing well. Have a great week.